He used to lose control over everything. His anger, his focus, his purpose. Every insult became a battle. Every failure, a storm. Until one day, he realized the world wasn't against him. His mind was. This channel tells real and fictional stories inspired by Napoleon Hill's timeless lessons about faith, focus, and the power of the mind. Subscribe for more stories like this, and tell us in the comments, what part of your life do you wish you could control today? Daniel always believed that control was the same thing as power. He loved that word, power. He held on to it like some people hold religion. Power meant you didn't get humiliated. Power meant nobody talked over you in a meeting. Power meant that when you entered a room, everything rotated around you like planets around a sun. That's what he thought winning looked like. And from the outside, it looked like he had it. He spoke fast. He walked fast. He dressed in clean black suits, always pressed, shoes that caught the light. His watch wasn't expensive, but it looked expensive. That was intentional. He'd figured out that most people didn't care whether something was real. They just wanted to believe you were doing better than them. Appear confident long enough, and people start treating you like you are. So people said he was sharp. People said, he has standards. People said, he doesn't tolerate disrespect. They said it like a compliment. But here's what they didn't see. He woke up every day already angry. Before the sun. Before the emails. Before the meetings. Angry. It was automatic. His first thought in the morning was never gratitude. Never presence. Never, I'm alive. His first thought was, who's going to mess it up today? He moved through the apartment in the dark, the way a soldier moves inside hostile territory. Coffee already bitter before it even hit his tongue. Jaw tight. Eyes heavy. Shoulders locked. The day hadn't touched him yet, and somehow he already felt attacked. That's the part no one knew. They thought his control was confidence. It wasn't. It was armor. And armor, worn every day, becomes a cage. He lived his mornings like rituals of tension. Phone in his hand before his feet even hit the floor. Notifications like hail. Red dots everywhere. Deadlines he didn't set. Demands he didn't ask for. Problems that weren't his, but would become his if he didn't catch them in time. His mind never started at zero. It started at survival. And then there were the meetings. There was always some version of it. A petty argument over wording in a pitch. Someone trying to take credit for a closed deal. A passive-aggressive comment disguised as feedback. Little battles. Little ego wars. Low-level politics that everyone swore they hated, and yet everyone played anyway. One morning, in a meeting, it happened again. A junior guy, maybe 24, clean hair, big smile, the kind of hungry politeness that looks like respect but is actually ambition, interrupted him mid-sentence. I just think, the kid said, we should maybe get someone else to talk to the client instead. You're a little intense. You can come off harsh. The room went quiet. Daniel felt heat flood his chest. He could hear his own pulse in his ears. There it was again. Disrespect. Threat. Challenge. All the alarms went off at once. He felt that familiar instinct rise like fire. Crush him. Prove control. Re-establish order. He leaned forward. He was ready to tear the kid apart in front of everyone. Casually, the way he'd done before. Not yelling. He never yelled. Yelling was emotional. He preferred to break people quietly. Then he saw it. The kid wasn't confident. The kid was afraid of him. He was talking a little too fast. He was smiling too hard. He was trying to make a move and also avoid getting hit. For a second, and only for a second, Daniel saw himself from the outside. He saw how people tensed up before they spoke to him. He saw how their sentences bent sideways, how they tried to predict his reaction before giving him news. He saw how everyone around him lived in tiny calculations, trying not to trigger him. That was the moment he felt it. Not pride, but disgust. Not with them. With himself. He didn't look like a leader. He looked like a threat. And a threat is not respected. A threat is only managed. After the meeting, he shut his office door and just stood there in the dark. The blinds were half closed, so the light came in as thin horizontal lines, cutting across his desk, his chair, his hands. Dust moved in the air like slow rain. For the first time in a long time, he didn't jump back into work. He just stood in it. He wasn't thinking about the kid. He was thinking about his father. His father had been the loudest person in any room. Not physically loud, emotionally loud. You felt him before he spoke. He walked like a warning. He had rules about respect, rules about tone, rules about how quickly you were supposed to answer when he called your name. His entire parenting style was tension, as if love and pressure were the same thing. When Daniel was 11, his father once made him redo an entire math assignment because he got one answer wrong. Not the whole page. One answer. Do it again, he said. If you can't get this right, you'll never survive in the real world. The world eats soft men. At 11 years old, the world eats soft men. That stuck. It didn't just stick. It branded itself into his nervous system. So what did Daniel learn? Never show weakness. And what did that become? Never show emotion. And what did that become? Never admit you're hurt. And what did that become? Attack first. It's easy to call that discipline from the outside. People love that word. Discipline. Sounds heroic. But in reality, what he built wasn't discipline. It was defense. Standing there in his office, in silence, in that thin striped light, he felt something like vertigo. Like the floor under him had shifted a few degrees. He whispered, almost without thinking, I became him. He had promised himself, years ago, that he would never turn into that man. He swore he would never be the kind of presence that made other people tighten their shoulders when they heard footsteps in the hallway. But he had. Different suit. Same energy. Different words. Same violence. He sat down slowly. His hands were still shaking from the meeting, from holding himself back. That was the part that scared him. He hadn't even done anything, and he was still shaking. How can a person call himself in control when his own body is physically shaking at the idea of being challenged? He opened the drawer of his desk and found an old notebook, the kind of cheap, beat-up notebook from a time when he still believed in improving himself instead of defending himself. Back when he still read. Back when he still wrote down ideas. Back when he believed the mind could be trained. He flipped through it. Messy pages. Goals. Routines. Plans. Things he said he'd do one day. Then he saw it. A phrase he had written and underlined twice. If you do not conquer self, you will be conquered by self. Napoleon Hill. He'd seen that line 100 times, quoted it to other people even, like wisdom he had mastered. But that day it didn't feel like wisdom. It felt like accusation. He whispered, so which one am I? He didn't like the answer. Because if he was honest, brutally, painfully honest, he wasn't conquering himself at all. He wasn't mastering thoughts, or emotions, or impulses. He was being dragged around by them. He was their hostage. A sophisticated hostage in a fitted suit. And then a worse thought came. If I'm not in control of me, who is? That thought stayed. He couldn't shake it. That night, at home, he didn't turn on the TV. He didn't blast music to drown his mind. He didn't run to distractions like he normally did. He sat on the kitchen floor, back against a cabinet, lights off except for the faint glow from the microwave clock. 22:41. He felt ridiculous. A grown man in a suit sitting on the floor of his own kitchen in the dark. But for some reason, the floor felt safer than the chair. The chair felt official, like he'd have to keep acting strong. The floor allowed honesty. He replayed the day, the meeting, the kid, the way everyone watched him like he was a knife on the table. He realized something that almost made his throat close. People didn't trust him because he was strong. People feared him because he was unstable. That was the first cut. The second cut went deeper. He admitted to himself, quietly, that he wasn't actually angry at other people most of the time. He was angry at himself for still being controlled by the same emotional reflexes he swore he'd outgrow. Angry that after all these years, after all this work, after all this pushing, he was still the little boy who flinched at the idea of being seen as weak. That's when the thought arrived. Not a motivational phrase. Not a pretty idea. A decision. I can't live like this anymore. Not I don't want to. Not I should change. I can't. There's a difference. I don't want to is a preference. I can't is a breaking point. He felt it. That quiet breaking point. The moment a person stops performing and starts telling the truth to himself. He didn't say it out loud, but he felt the vow form internally, almost like steel cooling into shape. I will not be ruled by reaction. No more explosions. No more tightening up at every challenge. No more turning every inconvenience into a war. No more needing to control everyone else just to feel safe in my own skin. He didn't know how to do that yet. He didn't have a method. He didn't have a plan. He had no spiritual language for it. No meditation routine. No breath work. Nothing. All he had was a line in an old notebook and a life he no longer respected. He got up from the floor and went to the mirror. He didn't like what he saw. There was no alpha male, no high performer, no elite mindset. Those were marketing phrases he repeated to protect his ego. The truth was simpler and uglier. He saw a tired man, with a tight jaw and red eyes, who was terrified of losing control because deep down he knew he'd never actually had it. And in that mirror, something shifted. His definition of control began to change. He had always thought control meant bending the world. But what if it meant bending himself? Not breaking, bending, training, directing. What if control wasn't dominance, but alignment? What if control wasn't I win, you lose, but I remain myself, no matter what happens? That idea, small as it was, entered him like a seed. That was the first night he didn't fall asleep to anger. He fell asleep to responsibility. He finally understood, you're either mastered by your own mind, or you become its master. There is no third state. There is no neutral. And for the first time in his life, he quietly chose mastery. Change never begins with peace. It begins with confrontation. And for Daniel, confrontation came disguised as everyday life. He had made the vow, I will not be ruled by reaction. But promises made in silence always get tested in noise. The next morning, the world came for him. A meeting rescheduled without warning. A late payment from a key client. An email full of passive-aggressive feedback from his partner. Little things. The usual chaos of business. Except this time, he was aware of every flicker inside his chest. He could feel the pulse of his old self rising. That rush of adrenaline. That heat crawling up the neck. That urge to fire back instantly, to reassert control. But instead, he paused. He took a single breath. And in that breath, he noticed something incredible. The moment you decide to stay calm, the world seems desperate to provoke you. He lasted 4 hours before breaking. At 11:36 a.m., his phone rang. It was his brother, Leo, the only person who still spoke to him without fear. Hey, Leo said. I need you to transfer the rent. You said you'd do it yesterday. I've been busy, Daniel replied flatly. It takes 2 minutes, man. I said I've been busy. There was silence. Then Leo sighed. You know, everything's always about you lately. Do you ever hear yourself? And that was it. The spark that found the gasoline. Do you have any idea what I deal with every day? Daniel snapped. You think money appears by magic? You think discipline grows on trees? You think. I think you love being miserable, Leo interrupted. It hit like a punch. Daniel froze. Excuse me, I said. Leo continued, his voice tired. You love being miserable. You've turned stress into your identity. You wouldn't know who you were without it. The line went silent. Daniel hung up. He sat there, breathing heavily, hand trembling on the desk. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, but instead he just stared at it, at his own reflection in the black screen, his own eyes looking back, full of rage and shame. And somewhere beneath the anger, he knew Leo was right. He didn't love misery, but he was addicted to it. He needed the tension to feel alive. He needed chaos to justify his existence. That afternoon, he tried to work, but his thoughts kept circling like vultures. Every unfinished sentence became proof that he was failing. Every delayed email became a personal insult. By sunset, he felt the full weight of what he'd built. A life so tightly controlled it couldn't breathe. He walked home instead of driving. The city around him pulsed with noise. Car horns, chatter, screens glowing from cafe windows. Every sound felt amplified. Every light too bright. He felt like a man watching his own life from a distance, detached and tired. He reached his apartment, turned on no lights, and sat in the dark. The silence was thick, almost physical. And for the first time, he didn't fight it. He let the thoughts come, all of them. The failures, the ego, the guilt, the endless loop of blame that always ended with him. He realized he had spent years trying to control outcomes instead of mastering the source of those outcomes, himself. He had trained the world to obey him, but never trained his own emotions to listen. He had chased success like it was therapy, achievement like it was salvation. And yet, every time he reached the top of a goal, he found the same emptiness waiting. It wasn't ambition that drove him. It was fear, the fear that if he ever slowed down, if he ever stopped performing, he would discover there was nothing underneath. He didn't cry. He couldn't. He just sat there until the city outside went quiet. Around midnight, he got up, opened the balcony door, and stepped into the cold night. The air stung his face. The city stretched beneath him. Millions of lights, millions of people, each believing they were in control of something. He realized how laughable it was. The illusion, the noise, the masks. He whispered to himself, "We're all pretending." And then he laughed, not from joy, but from recognition. Because pretending had been his profession. He pretended to be strong. He pretended to be untouchable. He pretended that every outburst was discipline and not a tantrum in disguise. He had built an empire of appearances, and in the process, lost the ability to tell the difference between control and fear. Inside, his phone buzzed again. He ignored it. He didn't want to talk. He wanted to listen, not to people, but to silence. Because in silence, truth finally had room to speak. He closed his eyes, and in the stillness, memories surfaced, old ones he'd buried under ambition. He saw himself as a boy, standing at the dinner table, his father shouting because he'd spilled water. He remembered the words, "Control yourself." He remembered how his small hands shook, how his throat locked, how his stomach twisted with the terror of being weak. And he remembered what came next, the decision that shaped his whole life. Never again. That was the seed of the iron mind. But it had grown in poisoned soil. The next day, Daniel woke early. No alarm, no rush. The air felt heavy, but calm. He made coffee, stared out the window, and for the first time in years, didn't reach for his phone. He just breathed. At work, he said nothing to anyone. People expected his usual sharp tone, but it never came. He moved slower, listened longer. When someone made a mistake, he almost reacted. He felt it in his hands, that twitch of control, but he stopped. He caught it. He watched it. He let it pass. It lasted 2 minutes, then 5, then a whole hour. He was exhausted, not from effort, but from awareness. Self-mastery, he realized, wasn't glamorous. It was grueling. It required constant presence, constant humility. That night, he went to visit Leo. They hadn't spoken since the argument. When Leo opened the door, Daniel didn't start with excuses. He just said, "You were right." Leo frowned. About what? About everything. They sat in silence for a while, just two brothers breathing the same air. And then Daniel said the words that had been trapped inside him for years. "I don't know who I am without control." Leo smiled sadly. "Then maybe it's time to find out." That sentence stayed with him long after he left. He walked home under streetlights that flickered like slow heartbeats. And as he moved through the quiet city, he began to understand the paradox Napoleon Hill hinted at decades ago, the law that all men eventually face. The more you try to control life, the more life controls you. But the moment you master yourself, the world begins to obey in silence. That night, lying in bed, he whispered a new vow. "Tomorrow, I begin again." He didn't know what that meant yet. He didn't know if he could actually change. But for the first time in years, he felt something close to hope. Not the noisy, external kind that depends on circumstances, but the quiet, internal kind that grows from truth. He was beginning to see that the mind, once mastered, becomes iron not because it feels nothing, but because it feels everything and still stays calm. He fell asleep before midnight, the city still humming outside, unaware that somewhere above it all, a man was learning to rebuild himself from the inside out. The next morning was quiet, unnervingly quiet. Daniel woke before dawn again, but this time there was no alarm, no rush, no mental checklist snapping open the second his eyes did. The first sound he heard was his own breathing. Steady, slow. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange stillness that filled the room. It wasn't peace yet, not really. It was emptiness. But emptiness was a start. He got up, poured water into the kettle, and waited for it to boil. The silence hummed louder than any machine. In that silence, he noticed how his hands didn't shake like they used to. The coffee cup didn't rattle when he picked it up. His thoughts didn't sprint ahead to the next task. They just stayed. Present. He sat on the balcony, watching the city wake up. Buses rolled by in the half-light. Somewhere, a construction site started hammering. The sound didn't bother him. He didn't feel invaded by it. It was just the world doing what the world does. For years, he had believed control meant silence, the ability to shut the world out. Now he began to understand that real control was the opposite, the ability to stay still within the noise. That was the beginning of his revelation. He decided to test it. That day, he went to work without his phone. He left it on the kitchen table, face down, as if leaving behind an addiction. The moment he stepped into the office, he felt the void. No constant buzz, no notifications feeding his need to react. He felt naked. But beneath the discomfort, there was a strange sense of liberation. The day unfolded like a test orchestrated by the universe. Traffic was heavy. Meetings ran late. A client canceled at the last minute. The version of Daniel from a month ago would have erupted before noon. But he kept breathing. When someone spoke rudely, he looked at them and thought, this is another chance to train. And each moment of restraint became a small victory. Not visible, not dramatic, quiet victories of mind over impulse. For the first time, he started to understand what Napoleon Hill meant by the mastery of emotion. At lunch, he sat alone in a nearby park. No phone, no music, just wind and distant voices. He watched an older man feeding pigeons, unhurried, fully absorbed in the simplicity of his gesture. The man smiled at nothing in particular. Daniel realized how foreign that kind of peace was to him. He'd built a life so full of urgency that he'd forgotten what peace even felt like. That's when he wrote it down on a napkin. The mind is not a weapon to fire. It's a muscle to train. He looked at the words, simple but true. Control wasn't domination. Control was discipline. And discipline was not suppression. It was awareness, direction, and patience. He began rebuilding himself from that idea. Over the next weeks, Daniel changed small things first. He stopped starting his mornings with emails. He began with silence, a ritual he didn't even call meditation. He just sat, breathed, and watched his thoughts parade through his mind without chasing them. He didn't realize it yet, but he was retraining his brain. He was teaching it to observe before reacting, to let emotion rise and dissolve before it became behavior. Sometimes he failed miserably. There were days when the old Daniel came roaring back. Sharp words, clenched fists, a storm of self-criticism. But even those failures started to look different now. They weren't proof of weakness. They were proof of awareness. Each failure gave him another chance to pause sooner, breathe deeper, rise faster. He learned something paradoxical in the process, that the more you watch the storm inside you, the calmer it becomes. It's not the world that needs to change, it's the observer. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Daniel was called to an important negotiation that would determine the future of his company. It was a room filled with egos, the kind of room that once would have triggered every defensive reflex he had. They started pushing early. Interruptions, doubts, sarcastic tones, subtle power plays. He felt the familiar surge of heat in his chest, the old voice whispering, "Show them who you are." But this time he smiled. He didn't respond. He just looked around the room, slowly, making eye contact with each person, not to intimidate, but to ground himself. Then he said calmly, "Let's focus on what actually matters." The tone of the room shifted instantly. The noise deflated. The people who had come ready to fight suddenly found themselves without a target. And that's when it hit him. Control wasn't about domination. It was about presence. The stillness of one man can silence the chaos of 10. After the meeting, one of the younger executives pulled him aside. "I don't get it," the man said. "You didn't raise your voice, you didn't push back, and somehow, everyone just followed your lead." "How?" Daniel thought for a moment. Then he replied quietly, "Because calm is louder than anger." That line stayed with him. It wasn't something he planned to say. It just emerged from the truth he'd finally begun to live. That night, walking home under streetlights, Daniel reflected on how different the world looked when he stopped trying to control it. It wasn't softer, it was clearer. He could see cause and effect where before he saw only injustice. He could see people's fears beneath their arrogance. He could see that most conflict was nothing more than wounded egos begging to be understood. He remembered something Hill wrote decades ago. "Your greatest power is your ability to choose your thoughts." He whispered it aloud as he walked, testing the weight of the words. They weren't theory anymore. They were experience. He had lived enough pain to know that everything outside was only a reflection of what lived inside. He reached his apartment and turned on no lights. In the dark glass of the window, he saw his reflection. He stood there for a long time, watching himself breathe. The man who stared back didn't look like the old Daniel. He looked older, calmer, wiser. There was still fire in his eyes, but it burned differently now. Not wild, but steady. Not consuming, but illuminating. He realized something profound. He hadn't become emotionless. He'd simply stopped being enslaved by emotion. He could feel deeply and still stay free. That was power. That was mastery. Over the following months, Daniel became almost unrecognizable to those who'd known him. He stopped arguing over small things. He no longer chased every opportunity out of fear of missing out. He made fewer moves, but each one with intention. Some people thought he'd lost his edge, but the truth was he'd sharpened it so finely that no one could see it anymore. He had become the kind of man who didn't need to prove control because he embodied it. He began mentoring younger colleagues, teaching them the principle that had saved him. Control yourself, and the world follows. It wasn't arrogance, it was alignment. One of them asked him once, "How did you change? How did you stop the anger?" Daniel smiled and said, "I didn't stop it. I just stopped letting it drive." Months later, during a company retreat, Daniel stood on a small wooden platform overlooking a lake. It was early morning. Mist curled over the water. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky gold. He had been asked to give a talk on leadership, but what he really spoke about was the mind. He told them how control begins as a lie, a survival instinct that grows into an addiction. He told them how power without peace destroys more than it builds. He told them that a man who cannot master himself cannot lead anyone. And as he spoke, he saw faces soften, eyes widen, postures relax. He realized they weren't listening to him. They were recognizing themselves. Every person there had a version of his storm. Every person had something they couldn't control that secretly controlled them. He ended his talk with a single sentence. The iron mind isn't built in comfort. It's forged in the moments when you want to explode but choose to stay still. Silence followed. Not applause. Not cheering. Just silence. The kind of silence that means truth has landed. He looked over the lake again, the morning sun now warm against his skin. And in that golden light, he finally felt it. Not the illusion of control, but the essence of it. The freedom of being unmoved by what used to shake him. The serenity of knowing that power doesn't come from what you hold, but from what you can release. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. No guilt, no anxiety, no noise. Just breath, his and the world's, moving as one. That was the iron mind. Not steel walls, but steady presence. Not coldness, but clarity. Not dominance, but direction. He whispered to himself, "Control this, and you control your life." And for once, it wasn't a command, it was a prayer. Daniel had mastered the silence within him, but the story wasn't over. The last act wasn't about victory, it was about reflection. Because even an iron mind must remember where it was forged. He never noticed when the noise stopped feeling like noise. It happened quietly, the way peace always does. There wasn't a grand ending, no dramatic sunrise, no final battle. There was just stillness, something he had spent years chasing in all the wrong places finally arriving, unannounced, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Daniel's days no longer felt like a war to be won. They became simple rhythms, waking before dawn, walking in silence, thinking slowly, speaking less. He noticed the small things now. The sound of shoes echoing down an empty hallway, the smell of coffee before the first sip, the warmth of sunlight spilling through blinds. These were things he had always passed by, too consumed by urgency to feel them. Now, they were proof that he was alive. People began to treat him differently, though he hadn't asked them to. The ones who used to fear his presence now sought his advice. They said he seemed lighter. They said he listened better. Some didn't know what had changed, but they felt it when he entered the room. There was an invisible calm that traveled ahead of him, a quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. He no longer chased being right. He chased being real. He no longer fought for control. He became control itself, not over others, but over himself. It surprised him how many years he had spent trying to fix the external world when all along, the problem had been internal disarray. He had tried to manage chaos by rearranging everything around him. People, schedules, opportunities, when all he needed was to manage the chaos of thought. That realization hit him like light after a long tunnel. The world doesn't obey force. It reflects frequency. You receive in proportion to the calm you carry. There were still moments that tested him. A late payment, a partner's betrayal, a friend's silence. He felt anger rise, but it no longer owned him. He would simply notice it, breathe through it, and let it pass like clouds across an unchanging sky. That was the difference. The storms didn't stop coming. He just stopped mistaking them for the sky itself. He thought of his father sometimes, the man whose voice had once thundered through every memory, whose demand for control had shaped his whole identity. For years, Daniel had blamed him. But as he grew, something shifted. He began to see not a tyrant, but a scared man who didn't know how to master his own fear. He had passed it on the only way he knew how, by controlling others. Realizing that truth didn't make the past easier, it made it understandable. And understanding is what turns pain into wisdom. One evening, Daniel drove back to his old neighborhood, to the house he hadn't seen in over a decade. It looked smaller now, fragile under the weight of memory. He sat in the car and watched the light fade across the cracked driveway. The ghosts of his childhood hovered quietly, the shouting, the slammed doors, the endless pressure to be perfect. He whispered into the silence, "I forgive you." It wasn't for his father. It was for himself. Forgiveness was the final act of control, the release of the past's grip on the present. When he left, something felt lighter, almost imperceptible. The chains that once bound him to resentment fell away without sound. He understood what Napoleon Hill meant when he said, "You are the master of your fate, the captain of your soul." It wasn't about power. It was about peace. A man in chaos can never steer his destiny. Only when he finds stillness can he truly direct his course. Months later, at a small gathering, someone asked Daniel what he had learned from his journey. He smiled, not in pride but in clarity, and said, "You can't control life. You can only control the one who lives it." People nodded, some politely, some deeply. Most would forget the line by morning, but a few wouldn't. Those were the ones ready to begin their own transformation, the ones who had reached their breaking point, the ones who were tired of being dragged by their emotions through the same repeating stories. Daniel watched them and thought about how strange it was that truth never shouts. It whispers. And yet, when you finally hear it, everything inside you changes shape. He kept a small journal now, not for goals or to-do lists, but for awareness. Every morning, he wrote one line. Some days it was simple, stay calm when tested. Other days it was deep, control is not strength. Surrender is. He didn't write to remind himself of who he wanted to be. He wrote to remember who he already was underneath all the noise. His company grew, slowly but steadily. People said he was lucky. They said he had timing. But luck was just calm meeting opportunity. Timing was just patience disguised as destiny. He worked with focus, but never haste. He learned that a steady mind makes faster progress than a restless one. He stopped pushing doors open and began walking through the ones that opened naturally. He no longer rushed to fill silence in conversations. He no longer needed validation after every decision. The man who once demanded the world listen now listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, people listened differently. Because truth, when spoken without ego, carries a tone that cuts through all resistance. He started reading Hill again, this time not for strategies, but for spirit. The words that once felt like business advice now felt like scripture. Self-discipline begins with the mastery of thought. He underlined it and wrote in the margin, and ends with peace. Every morning, he stood in front of the mirror. He no longer searched for signs of progress or fatigue. He simply looked into his own eyes. In that reflection, he didn't see the man he had been. He saw the man he had built. Not perfect, not unshakable, but whole. The kind of man who could sit in a storm and not lose himself to it. It was strange, he thought, how the journey began with anger. How pain was the entry point to wisdom. If his world hadn't fallen apart, he would have never questioned it. If he hadn't lost control, he would have never learned what control really meant. That was the paradox. Suffering was the door to freedom all along. He began to see the iron mind not as a title, but as a practice. Every day required it. Every moment asked for it. The discipline wasn't in never feeling anger again. It was in meeting anger with awareness. The mastery wasn't in killing emotion. It was in walking with it without being burned. Sometimes he caught himself smiling at nothing, the kind of smile that comes from deep recognition. The realization that life was never meant to be tamed, only understood. The more he tried to dominate it, the smaller he became. The moment he surrendered, he expanded. That was the secret no book could teach. Control isn't holding tighter, it's holding lighter. On one of his walks through the city, he saw a man yelling at a barista for getting his order wrong. The man's face was red, his voice sharp, his body trembling with fury over something that didn't matter. Daniel didn't judge him. He recognized himself. That used to be him. The one mistaking emotion for strength, mistaking chaos for passion. He whispered silently, "I hope you find it too." He didn't mean success. He meant stillness. By the time night fell, Daniel sat once again on his balcony, the same one where his transformation began. The city lights flickered below like restless thoughts, and the stars above glowed like distant clarity. He breathed deeply, feeling the same air that had once carried his rage, now carrying his peace. Life hadn't changed. He had. The external storms still raged, but his inner weather had turned serene. He thought of everyone still trapped in that illusion. The illusion that control is something you exert on the world. He wanted to tell them that control isn't about dominance. It's about direction. It's about choosing your thoughts the way an artist chooses colors, the way a musician chooses notes. And if you can choose your thoughts, you can shape your destiny. That's what Napoleon Hill meant all along. The iron mind wasn't a gift. It was built through failure, through humility, through relentless observation of self. It wasn't the absence of emotion. It was the mastery of reaction, the calm that turns pain into power, the patience that turns noise into music, the discipline that turns chaos into creation. He closed his eyes and whispered one last thought, a sentence that had been forming for months but only now felt ready to leave his lips. Control this, and you control everything. He wasn't talking about the world anymore. He was talking about the mind, the only kingdom that ever truly belongs to you. The night breeze touched his face, and he smiled. Not the smile of victory, but of understanding. Somewhere in that quiet city, someone was still fighting their reflection, trying to bend the world to their will. Maybe one day they would hear this story and see what he had seen. That control doesn't come from force. It comes from faith. It comes from choosing to stay still when everything inside you wants to react. It comes from remembering that your thoughts are the architects of your reality. If you learn to control them, life becomes a mirror that finally obeys. He looked at the horizon, eyes calm, mind steady, and whispered the truth he had been searching for all his life. Peace is power. And in that stillness, the world seemed to bow quietly in agreement. If this story touched something inside you, subscribe for more tales inspired by Napoleon Hill's timeless wisdom. And tell me in the comments, what part of your life do you want to master next?